start. Well, hello, everyone. How nice of you to come out on a rainy Tuesday night. I mean, that's dedication that you even come out. And I'm very honored that you would like to hear something about my life. This mic is a little odd, so I'll just work with it. I hope it works well enough. It has to be in my mouth in order for you to hear me. This is funny. So, first of all, I want to thank Cheryl. It doesn't bend. It just like doesn't bend. There. Is that okay? So I want to thank Cheryl especially because Cheryl organizes this wonderful event so that all of us can get to know each other better. You see, it goes way from my now. And more than that, I really thought about this a little moment because I've already done a forum, and some of you, many of you, have been at that forum. So why would I do another thing? Then I realized it was a great opportunity to think about my whole life in a holistic way. Like, what happened all those years? What happened? And to kind of take a look at that. And so, people could define their lives by the relationships they've had, or maybe the jobs they've had, or perhaps the loves they've had in their lives. But when I really started to look at my life in a whole piece, it felt to me like if I put it together, it was kind of like a patchwork quilt. That I could actually sew it together, I could put it all together, and it made sense in one whole. And what I figured out was that for whatever reason in my life, can you all hear me? I have always been the kind of person who sees a little hole in the society I'm in, a need. And I think, okay, what skills do I have that could fill that need? And then I jump in and try to create something to fill that need. And so if you're willing, I'm going to take you on a really rapid journey through my 68 years of life and, play a little bit with you. If you're all ready to do that with me? Okay. So, I am the oldest of 5 in an Irish Catholic family. We were all born within 7 years of each other. My mother was very busy, as you can imagine. And our house was the center of the universe for the neighborhood. Everybody came there because we invented all the games. We played all the sports. Everybody wanted to be at our house because it was fun. It was chaotic and crazy and fun. And I was the oldest. So my mother and father would say, Joanne, you're in charge. Take over. So I got used to sort of making up things that we were all going to do. Where? Livingston, New Jersey. And one of the things that I did a lot was create backyard plays. I loved theater. I loved musicals. I memorized every Broadway musical. So I produced all these shows in the backyard for our neighborhood, with our neighbors, with the kids. And I did carnivals and summer camps and everything. I was always making up things to do. And to this day, the kids who grew up in my neighborhood still talk about Oliver, which was the last show we did when I was about 12. I was Fagin. He's a really bad guy, And I made all the kids be in it. Everybody in our neighborhood had to be in it. There were 15 kids in it. And we raised money for the Red Cross. And we donated it at the end, and we were in the newspaper of our hometown. And they still all talk about Oliver. So after that, I grew up a little, and I took a lot of dance classes. And I went to college. I was in the dance program and the dance troupe in my university. And I love dance. I always have loved dance. But I went to school in 1969. And I think some of you remember what happened in 1969. The anti-war movement was huge. So I transferred from my little girls' Catholic school to the University of Wisconsin in the middle of the anti-war movement. And there I was, one of the very active people trying to fight against the war. And I also was involved in the early stages of the women's movement. which had a very strong formative role in my life. Well, on the last day of school, towards the end of my time in school, my roommate from my first college said, "Oh, well, we have to go to Paris. We've never lived in France." And so, of course, we flew to France, and we went and started taking French classes, and I took mime. In France, they call it mime, and I used to study, as Hester, who's sitting here, knows, with a teacher of Marcel Marceau. And I joined a group, an international cabaret, and I toured all around Belgium and France, doing mime and performing for people all over the area. At the end of that, I went back to the United States, and I went to see all my friends, and they were all about to join a circus. They were about to go up to Oregon and join a circus. And I said, well, I could teach dance and I could teach mime. So can I come? And I had 2 suitcases and I threw them on the truck and I jumped on the truck and I went off to join the circus. And so then, for about a year, I would go to the parks and I would play with all the people. And I would do all kinds of fun things with people. And it was an incredible experience. In fact, one of the most spiritual things I ever did, because you're so intensely involved with people. And you can go right in their face, even because you're a clown and they let you. So one day, this lady came up to me and she said, would you be willing to go to all the Indian reservations in the Northwest and work with the community there, because there's no spirit there? And I said, okay. So our little troupe jumped in a truck, and we started touring Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota. And we went into these communities where the man would be sitting in the back row. We have a meeting. We'd arrive, and we'd get in a big meeting of the community. And the man would be in the back row, and they were all drunk. And the women were in the front row, and they were all nervous. And the kids were all over the place. And we'd say, okay, we're going to put on a circus. Our circus is called Everybody's Family Circus. And we want you to make the costumes, you mothers. And we want you men to make the sets. And we want you kids to be in it. You're going to be in the circus with us. So throughout the week, all of a sudden you'd see a father and a son working to build something, a mother and a daughter creating a costume. And by the end of the week, we put on a big circus. And the whole community was involved. And it was an incredibly interesting experience. And then we would jump in a truck, and we would drive to the next reservation. And who knows what happened to that wonderful community. Probably didn't last that long, but it was great for a week. So, I gotta remember what I'm doing here. All right, 1 second. So then, my boyfriend, who was at Harvard Business School, was moving to Nicaragua, Managua, Nicaragua. And he said, why don't you come down and visit me for a couple weeks? And so I said, I'll come, but only for a few weeks. And I got down there, and at first I didn't know, what am I going to do here? So I taught dance, and I taught drama at the American School. But before long, I met a woman who was in the Peace Corps, who was the head of the Peace Corps. She said, listen, why don't you come and join the Peace Corps here in country? It would be so great if you would come into the poor barrios as a clown. So before you know it, I was driving my little car into these poor barrios, and all the children would run out and say, payasa, payasa, payasa. And they'd all come out. And the job was to teach them that washing your hands before you eat is a good idea. Or boiling your water before you drink is a good idea. Or getting vaccinations is a good idea, or you're going to get very sick. So So many people came out. I used to drive into the neighborhoods, and all these children would run behind my car and say, Doña Joanna, Doña Joanna. So it was an exciting little way to create social message using the skill that I had. Well, I was living with all these people who were already PhDs at Harvard or MBAs at Harvard, and I thought I have to go back to school. So I applied to Harvard and I applied to Stanford. And ironically, or surprisingly, I got into both. So, okay, I called up Stanford. Hello, I'm Joanne Grady. And they said, Joanne Grady from Nicaragua? Really? How interesting. I said, yeah, wow, they know who I am. So I hung up, then I called Harvard. Hi, I'm Joanne Grady. They said, what's your registration number? But in the end, Harvard gave me a scholarship. And so I went to Harvard. Now, before I left Nicaragua, a strange and wonderful thing happened. I was working with all these nuns and priests who were the ones I was working with in the Peace Corps. And it turned out that all of them were Sandinistas. And while I was there, Pedro Joaquim Chamorro was killed, and Somoza was overthrown by Daniel Ortega, who is now again in power in Nicaragua. And the revolution happened. Right before I left, the beginnings of the revolution happened. And all those nuns and priests with whom I was working were actually undercover Sandinistas. So big surprise. So I went to Harvard and I joined an unusual group at Harvard Ed School, Harvard School of Education. They have a laboratory there where you do study educational development. And we studied Piaget and some of the other development things. And we would take the development stages that people have when they're growing up and put them into segments for Sesame Street. So I brought Grover along today. Hi, Grover. Hi. Hello, everyone. How are you? You all know Grover. He's a famous Muppet from Sesame. And so we made segments for these Muppets, which was so fun. So we would take some kind of educational goal, like teaching the letter F, or teaching social responsibility, like sharing, and we would make the puppets do those segments. And before we put it on Sesame Street, we would take the puppet, and we would go out and meet these little 3 or 4-year-old kids, and we would talk to them. We would sit down and talk to them. And the amazing thing that we discovered was that the kids talked directly to Grover. They did not see Frank Oz, who was the puppeteer of Grover. They did not see his arm. They did not see his body. They just saw Grover. And so we knew, wow, this really works. They really will learn from these Muppets. So I went on to work for The Electric Company, which is another TV show that some of you may have heard of, and for a show called Zoom, which is a kids show. And that was the most fun job I ever had, because the idea of that show was that you don't want kids to watch TV. You want them to turn off the TV and go do something. So we asked kids all over the country to write us their ideas for plays, for stories, for poems, for games, for science experiments, for recipes. And they sent us letters. And we got like 10,000 letters in a week. And we would pick the best ones. And then I worked with the studio kids, there were 10 of them, to produce those segments for the television. So they would do the play, or they would do the poem, or they would do the story. And then they would tell the kids at home, now go home, turn off the TV and go do it, you know? So the whole idea was, you know, don't watch TV, do something with your life. All right. So while I was at Harvard, a man came to my door and he said, I heard there's another clown at Harvard. Yes, well, I am a clown. Are you a clown? It turns out he had been a Fulbright scholar, and he was in Bali. And he came back with about 30 of the most beautiful, incredible Balinese temple masks that he collected there. And he wanted to know if I would do a show with him, where we would tour around the college campuses in the Northeast and do mime and mask theater. So before long, the two of us took to the road. These are some of the amazing masks. I'll pass this around afterwards. And we did a mime and mask show called Mudhead Masks. And this was a show at Harvard Loeb Drama Center. But we performed at very many different university campuses. And afterwards, what we did was we would teach them how to work with masks. Now, this may not work with my microphone, but masks can be very, very powerful, sometimes more so than even your person or your mask as a clown. So we would teach them, and unfortunately, I don't have any of the Balinese masks. This is a mask from Kenya. But we teach them about mask work. Well, I was performing, this was mime and mask, very silent theater. And this woman came up to me and she said, would you be willing to work with deaf adolescents and teach them theater and dance? I said, well, I've never met anybody who's deaf. I have no idea anything about that. So, before you know it, I was involved in a totally deaf world. I was the only hearing person in the group. And we toured around. I wrote plays. I taught dance. I produced TV shows. And we broadcasted ideas about deafness. And then after the show, we would sit down and we would discuss about deaf awareness. It was very interesting for me because I learned visual learning, which really broadened my mind. But the money, as usual. So what? I got on a plane and I flew to Washington, D.C. And in Washington, some of you have probably heard of Special Olympics. Kennedy family had a program called Special Olympics. They also had a program called Very Special Arts, run by Jean Kennedy Smith, who is the youngest sister of John Kennedy. So I went in saying, you know, I need money for my deaf program. And they said, well, we don't have any money. But how would you like to be a trainer and go around the United States and work with artists and special education teachers and teach them how to use arts to work with disabled children? I said, okay, I'll do that. And before long, I met a man who was quadriplegic. He dove into a swimming pool and he broke his neck, so he was paralyzed from the waist down. And he asked me, can you teach me how to dance? I said, sure, I can teach you how to dance. We're going to dance. And so together, we made a movie, and we performed that movie. We showed that movie all over the United States. And we started the movement of wheelchair dancing. And I taught wheelchair dancing in every state of the country for very many years. And my husband doesn't know how to do it. But I asked him to be my guinea pig tonight. So anyway, it was a wonderful job because I learned so much about how to expand the arts to make sure that many people, thank you, Liv, many people are involved. So one day, Mrs. Jean Kennedy Smith said to me, why don't you, I would like you to, I hear you speak Spanish, which I do. And so she said, would you come with me? I want you to come to Peru because I want to start an international program. So I went to Peru with Mrs. Smith, and before you know it, she's sending me to every country in the world. So for about 5 years, she sent me to about 50 countries. And it wasn't just like, go to the country, because when you work for the Kennedys, it's incredible. She would say, okay, when you go to Sweden, call the Queen. And I would say, call the Queen? She'd say, yes, call the Queen. And the Queen would say, come on over and have tea. And I would ask her to do an arts festival for people who had disabilities. And then she'd say, when you go to Italy, call the Pope. I couldn't believe that she said that to me. I said, really, call the Pope? But I did call the Pope, John Paul at the time. And literally he said, come on over, let's discuss this. And before long, we did very special arts festivals all over the world. I had a program in 80 countries where everybody did different programs and performances. This is a program of Dance for the Blind. Hester, who's here tonight, is going to do a program on blind dance with the Gulf Shore Players, and I'm going to get involved in that a little bit. So the program was amazing. It was just this amazing opportunity to mix arts and cultures and disabilities all in the same place. I felt like I was in a Fellini movie half of the time. There were so many different things going on. So one day I was looking for money to do a program in China. I was going to take some artists. We were going to work in China to try to set up a very special arts program in China. And I went to a cocktail party in Washington, D.C., and I met this gentleman right here. And lo and behold, we had a lot in common. He had been traveling around the world hitchhiking. Of course, I was flying around. We had both gone to the University of Wisconsin during the anti-war movement. And more than that, he was a China analyst for the Department of State. And I was looking for money for China. So I got the money. I got the husband. And more than that, before you know it, within a year, I was living in China. Because one night when I was in China with my artists, Jim called me and said, "Hello, how do you like it in China?" I said, "Well, it's interesting." And he said, "Take a good look around. You might move there." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I just got into the Foreign Service." And I said, "I don't even know that you applied for this Foreign Service." But sure enough, he got into the Foreign Service, and within a year, we were living in Beijing. Now, that was the old China, where everybody wore Mao jackets. There were hundreds of bicycles, no cars. It was communist, heavy communist country. What happens? Jim goes off to the American Embassy, and there I am. I don't speak Chinese. I don't know anything about the culture, and I'm stuck in China. What am I going to do? So I go to the park in the morning and start doing Tai Chi, which was actually very interesting. I loved Tai Chi. I can't remember how to do that. Flashing clouds. But while I was doing my Tai Chi, I noticed all the other people in the park were doing ballroom dancing because it was just opening up to the West, and they were all really interested in Western things. So I thought, oh, I'm a dancer. I know how to dance. I guess I'll teach dance. So before long, I was going to all these different schools in Beijing, teaching square dance and ballroom dance and all kinds of programs. But I really still was worried about disabled people because I'd done, almost 9 years with the Kennedy family. So one day I went over to the China Disabled People's Federation. Now, the head person in China at the time was Deng Xiaoping. He was the premier of China. Some of you probably know about him. His son was named Deng Pufang. And Deng Pufang was in a wheelchair. He had been pushed out of a window during the Cultural Revolution, and he was paralyzed from the waist down. And this was in the beginning of the country awareness about disability. And there I was. I knew a lot about disability. I'd been for 10 years running around the world working with people who had disabled conditions. So he said, "I'll hire you. I want you to," he didn't pay me, let me say that much, but he said, "I'll let you go. Please go to the different schools and teach them. How do you use arts to teach people to move if they're physically disabled, or if they're blind, or if they're deaf? How do you do painting if you can't use your arms? How do you do theater if you're deaf?" So I went to all the schools in Beijing by myself. I went to the school for the blind, the school for the deaf, the school for the physically disabled, the school for the mentally disabled. I went to all of them, and I worked with the staffs. And one day I went to an orphanage, and I went in, and I noticed that there were about 750 children there, and they were all in their beds. They didn't even take them out of the bed. And more than that, they weren't disabled, they were girls. The only reason they were there was that China had a one-child policy. Most people didn't want a girl. They abandoned their girls. These girls were found on the street. I said, "This can't happen. We have to do something here. We've got to get these kids out of the bed." So I put an ad in the newspaper calling myself Beijing International Volunteers. And I wrote a note saying, if you're a foreigner and you'd like to meet some Chinese people, I have a way. And I got about 40 people. And then I worked with them for about 6 weeks, teaching them how to work with people who have different disabilities. And after a while, they started going into the orphanage. And we had all kinds of programs going on. Some people were teaching sports, some people were teaching dance, some people were teaching music, some people were teaching acting. And these kids who had been lying in their bed had all this amazing stuff happening. But as some of you heard when I talked before about the forum, within about 9 months of our time in Beijing, Tiananmen Square happened. And as you know, it was a major change in the country. Jim and I were very involved in going out and talking to people about what happened to us during the anti-war movements in the United States. They were building their democracy movement. But after the massacre happened on June 4th, 1989, the US and China were not talking to each other at all. There was no connection between the two countries. And I couldn't do my orphanage project anymore. All of that had to stop. So a friend from Washington wrote me a note and said, I would love to do a women's conference in China. These were dark times in China. But I trekked over to the All China Women's Federation, and I said, how about if women are the first ones to have a dialogue after Tiananmen? How about if we create a conference between Americans and Chinese women? And surprisingly, they bought the idea. Really, they bought the idea because down the road in 1995, they were going to do the UN conference on women. And if you remember, Hillary Clinton went to that. It was a big event. They wanted to practice. So all these American women came. They said they did papers on date rape, depression, rape, everything else. And then the Chinese women got up and said, all relationships in China are harmonious. We have perfect lives, no problem. Everything had been censored. However, in the hallways and the byways after the official conference, women were talking, women were meeting each other. And so I feel that it was really a worthwhile project. So after that, I went home. Jim and I went home. We had a few children. We have 2 children. Christopher, who's our son, and Caroline, who's our daughter, were born. And we were in the States a very short time, where they got used to just being an American child. But before long, very soon after that, we were transferred. Whoop. I'm not sure I can do this. Hook, hook. Thank you. We were transferred to South India, to the city at the time called Madras. It's now called Chennai. And I went with a 1-month-old baby on my hip and a 2-year-old, which was pretty hard. As you can imagine, that was not an easy thing to do. My son was made in China, but not born in China. So there I am with my 2 children, and it was a tough adjustment. It really was. Again, theater and dance saved me. I got involved in the theater. I performed all over the place in lots of plays. And I met a lot of Indian women. I had a lot of friends. And one day I was having lunch with one of my Indian friends, and I said to her, if I had so much trouble adjusting to life in India, what's going to happen to foreigners, expatriates who are setting up businesses here? They're going to have a terrible time. It's a really hard place. It's hot, mosquitoes. It's very culturally different. So we set up a business together, and she was willing to do it with me, and we call it Global Adjustments. And what it is a relocation company, and we help people get oriented to life in India. We give them orientation. We take them around. We show them where the hospitals are, where the schools are, how they can hire a staff, how they can set up a home, all the things that they need to know in a very strange culture. And this business came to India just at the right time. It started out with just one office in Chennai. I'll pass that around. And now we have 6 offices all over India. So a few years ago, she and I, we celebrated our 20th anniversary of the company by writing a book called Make It in India. And we interviewed 10 CEOs of companies in India, 5 of whom were Americans and 5 of whom were Indians. And they told us what they did to make these cross-cultural teams work. How does it work when you're working with 2 extremely different cultures? And we had a big celebration for the 20th anniversary. And this is Ranjini, my partner, and me. And this is a magazine that we still put out. We started way back then. It goes to almost all expatriates in India now. And it tells them what's going on in arts and theater and dance and everything. So I'll pass that around too, and you can take a look. Pass all this stuff around. What the heck? So at the end of India, there was one more thing that happened, and that was this. I was worried about the business people. Where were they going to put their children? There are no schools. All the schools were full. They were full, and they were Indian curriculum. It's a very different curriculum than expatriates know. So again, with some friends, we started a school. We started the American International School. At the time, it was called Madras. Now it's Chennai. And we started with 18 kids. 2 of them were my kids. I had a little 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. And they started the school. We began in a very humble way. 20 years later, Jim and I went back, and we saw this amazing school. They now have a $10 million building. They have 1,000 kids from pre-K to K through 12, swimming pool, sports fields, everything. Several hundred people worked there, and we realized we had provided not only a school for the foreigners, but jobs for a lot of people. So when we left India, I felt like our little seeds made a big difference. After India, we were sent to Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya, which is a bit different from India, or China, for that matter. So when we first went there again, I got very involved in theater. I performed all over. I toured, raised money for building schools and building hospitals. We donated our funds to a lot of different sources. And as you probably remember, some of you heard, during the 3rd year we were there, one day I was taking my children to the embassy for a checkup with the doctor. And they were 5 and 8 at the time. And we went in, we parked next to a big, huge truck, and we went into the basement. And about 1 minute after we got there, the building was bombed by Al-Qaeda. And it blew up. And Jim, my husband, was on the 4th floor of the embassy at that time in a meeting in the office of the ambassador. So my children and I had to find our way out of that dark, cavernous basement. First of all, we had to find each other. Then we had to crawl down a dark hall through glass and wires and cement and everything. It was dark. It was tough. And at the very end, we saw a light. And so we crawled through this hole in the wall and out through the light. And we ran out the garage. And where my car had been parked was a huge wall of fire. And it was the epicenter of the bombing. So my kids and me ran around the outside of the embassy. And at that moment, Jim, of course, was on the 4th floor thinking that his kids and his wife had been killed. He came down the stairwell, and many people on the 3rd floor were injured. Everyone on the 2nd floor was killed. Everyone on the 1st floor was killed. And we had planned to meet each other on the 1st floor for lunch, but we were all late. So he tears out of the front of the embassy, and our family, my kids and I, tear around the other side. And luckily, the story ended happily. And we found each other, and we ran away. So I was the head of the American Women's Association at the time. And the American Embassy people, and Jim also, they were very involved with survival. 12 Americans had been killed, hundreds were hurt, the embassy was destroyed, they had a lot to take care of. But 256 Kenyans were killed. Thousands of Kenyans were hurt. So I thought, we have to do something here. So I started a relief fund, a Kenyan relief fund for the Kenyans who were victims of the bombing. And I went around and met different people. I met children who had been in a bus in front of the embassy when it blew up, and they were all blinded, and they didn't know what had happened to them. But we found money, and we sent them to Boston, to the Boston Eye and Ear Hospital. And many of them had surgeries. Some of them gained some sight back, and they were able to come back and try to live their lives. We met deaf people who lost all their jobs because they couldn't hear. The blast had made them deafened. We helped get some implants, some rehabilitation. And then one day I met a woman, and she had been in the building behind the embassy, which had collapsed completely, and she was under a wall for 4 days until they found her. And she was paralyzed from the waist down. And I met her in a hospital, and she said, life is over. I can't live, nothing. And she was praying to God. I said, listen, it's not over. You can live, and we're going to send you to South Africa to get rehabilitated. So we sent her for several months to South Africa, and she came back in a wheelchair. And she rolled off the plane, and she had a red bomber jacket on and a red cap, and she came off the plane, and she was like this. And I thought, we have helped this woman who was hopeless have hope. And so she and I worked together to rehabilitate her, rehab her house so that she could live there. And she actually was able to go back to school, to work. And one night, I took her to a discotheque. And it was a restaurant, we were having dinner, and there was a discotheque floor, and I thought, my whole life is coming together right this second. Why did I learn how to teach people in wheelchairs? Here I am. I have to take her out on the floor. So Teresa, her name is Teresa, and I went out in the middle of the discotheque. The whole place cleared away, and we danced together. And at that moment, she said she knew that life can have some joy, even if you have a disability. So it was an amazing rehabilitation for me and her. So after Kenya, we went back to the United States. And well, I had worked with people in cross-cultural training. That was my work. So I decided to teach some courses at the Foreign Service Institute at the State Department. And then I also worked for the International Visitors Program. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but it's a wonderful program that the State Department does, where they bring foreigners to America. Say you're a lawyer, or you're a teacher, or you're a businessman. They bring people from other cultures to the United States to meet their counterparts. And I set up all the programs for them, so they would meet people in the same field that they were in. And it was a very soft diplomacy. We weren't selling anything. But by the end of the time, they really got what America's about and how good the people are and how wonderful our country is. So it was a really interesting project for me. Well, oh, I forgot something. Oh, no, I did forget something. Oh, yeah. So we had to decide. We lived there during a very hard time in the United States. 9/11 happened the year after we got home. The sniper happened in Washington, if any of you remember that. It was a really scary time to be in America. And our kids were preteens, and we talked to them and said, do you want to stay in the United States? Or do you want to go back overseas where we had been bombed? Where is safer? But the kids said, we want to be international people, and we want to go. So we got posted to Taiwan, the beautiful, lovely island of Taiwan, where the people are so genuinely nice. And the old Chinese culture still exists. They're conservative and kind and lovely. And while I was there, I worked for the school. I ran for school board and won, and worked to integrate Taiwanese people with foreign people. And that wasn't easy, because there was this feeling that the foreigners were taking over things. and the Taiwanese people wanted to be part of the school. And so we had a really interesting time. But I love Taiwan. It's a beautiful place. Well, after Taiwan, we came back to America. And at that time, I decided I would write a book about all the things that I've done. So I wrote this book, and some of you told me that you read it, which I'm very impressed. And really what it's about is about the fact that we are all diplomats. If you meet a foreigner, if you are educated overseas, if you work overseas, if your next door neighbor is from another country, if your best friend's husband is from another country, you represent the United States. And so whoever you meet, whenever you meet them, you're a diplomat. You're showing them what America can be or should be. And so this book is really about that. It's really about how you can make a difference. And I think it's really important at this time when the official diplomacy is really struggling, that all of us as unofficial diplomats have a role to play to make sure that people understand America is not what our government is. America's a good place. But at the end of that, I still wasn't sure like what to do. And I thought I need to give back to all the countries that I've lived in. How can I give back? And how can I make the most impact? And I thought, I've met so many women overseas, and many countries, the women's situation is difficult. But if you empower a woman, you can really change the society. You can change her family, her community, and sometimes her country or her world. So with a couple other women, I started an organization. And for the last 7 years now, I've been running that organization. It's an NGO, and we are training adolescent girls all over the world. We've gone to 5 continents, worked with thousands of kids. And it's the same thing that I was doing in my life. I was trying to tell them that you're a player. And if you see something that you could do to make your society better, then step forward. And then we would work with them. If they had an idea, we would work with them throughout a week until they produced their project, their idea for the project. So before we stop for questions, and I want to give you time for questions, I'm going to show you a short clip of some of the women, the girls, with whom I've worked. I hope this works. And let's see if this comes on. What they're doing now. I mean, it has been such a rewarding job because I do feel that if you work with girls, you can really make a difference in their lives just by telling them that they too could be a leader. They too could be somebody. So here's a short clip, and then we'll stop for some questions.
Being here today, speaking at the General Assembly Hall is a great privilege to me and many other young people who continue to work hard every day to achieve their dreams. And it is a manifestation of how far we have come. Young people today are more involved on the issues that affect them and are demanding better. They are on the forefront, tackling issues that range from access to education, gender inequality, unemployment, peace and security, pandemics such as the recent Ebola outbreak, and climate change.
Women constitute 15.3% of the national population in South Africa, but we still face a high level of gender power imbalances as well as gender inequitable norms. It is very important that we understand once again that women's rights are human rights, and that we ensure that the best principles that will allow women to develop both economically as well as politically are well justified.
Back in 2009, I was thinking about what I would have liked as a young woman to help me reach my dreams. And I thought if we could create an organization that would help young women dream big and then give them the confidence and the capabilities and the courage to go after those dreams, they could do amazing things to change the world.
I had lived as part of the Foreign Service all over the world. And I wanted to help create an organization that promoted cultural understanding and global awareness among young women.
I wanted to create an organization that gives young women the skills, the tools, the inspiration and the support that will help them bring about constructive change in their worlds.
And together, we created I Live to Lead.
We've hosted international young women's leadership summits all around the world and taught a unique curriculum that inspires confidence and gives courage to these young women. In this video, we want you to meet some of our outstanding graduates who have gone on to do some amazing things around the globe.
My name is Pauline from Kenya. My first summit was in 2011 in Washington, D.C.
I'm Yashaswini Rajeshwar and I'm from Chennai, India. I was at Munich in June 2012 and then at the DLD Women's Conference the same year.
My name is Anna Blue and I'm a recent graduate of Stanford University. I was a participant in both the conference in the summer of 2010 in Washington, D.C. and then a returning participant in the conference in 2012 in China.
I'm Lisa Fu. I'm 25 years old and I'm from Germany.
My name is Chiara. I'm from Italy and I've been for several years the social media director for I Live to Lead.
My name is Jessica and I'm from Mexico, currently living in Barcelona. I attended 2013 I Live to Lead Summit in Washington, D.C.
My name is Janara. I'm from Kyrgyzstan and I was delegate of I Live to Lead Summit in Munich.
I am Ines Rubillon. I'm from France. The first time I attended I Live to Lead Summit, that was in Munich. That was during the Digital Life Design Conference.
And one thing we know is nobody can do it alone. So that's why we created a support system, both for the young women amongst themselves around the world. They could meet other young women like themselves, and then also a support system of professional, accomplished role models in media, business, politics, diplomacy, every field, to be role models and mentors for these young women.
We've created a global network of young women leaders who are ready to make change in their home countries and are connected to each other everywhere.
So in closing, I just want to tell you that since I've lived in Naples for the last few months, almost a year, I wrote a book which is about the work we've done, and it shares the curriculum that we use to train young women so that girls all over the world who haven't had a chance to come to our program could get inspired to do something and make a difference in their society. So in closing, I'm just going to read a little bit from the back of it, and then I'll open it up for questions. Our goal in writing this book is to share our path to leadership curriculum with young people worldwide, particularly young women who have dreams they hope to achieve. We especially want to reach out to those young people who didn't have the chance to attend I Live to Lead. In these pages, we lay out the steps toward actualizing a full-fledged project. We encourage you to follow the steps we've outlined. We've given you a roadmap to achieve your goals. Work to make them real. Give them substance. Plan how you will accomplish them. Communicate and connect with others about your ideas. And always continue to grow and learn throughout the process. Start today to do what makes you feel passionate and alive, because the world urgently needs more people who will make a difference. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? I took you on such a wild trip. I don't know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer a few if you want. Bill?
You've honored us in an extraordinary way, in so many different dimensions. I'm very touched, and there was a common thread in your various experiences throughout your lifetime. And I guess the question, I know you're not the sort of person to live in the past. Where do you think your future is going to take you?
That's a good question. Well, I'm so new here, and I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to contribute to Naples. And I don't know yet. I've gotten involved in some things, as Hester is here from the Gulf Shore Players, and I've joined her education committee and hope to help them a little bit. And I'm involved in some other things, the League of Women Voters. But I feel like, and this church, I feel like it's so easy to get overwhelmed with things to do that I want to be able to do the right thing that I can make the most contribution towards. So I'm not sure yet. You know, I'm a worship associate here, you know, and we'll see. I'll keep you posted.
Language. How did you handle the language issue in all of these countries?
Yeah, very hard. I speak French, and I learned Spanish when I lived in Nicaragua, right? So with those two languages, I was able to then really work to learn. I learned Italian because it's quite similar. And when I went to Brazil, I could figure out Portuguese pretty well. When I met Jim, I didn't know any Chinese, and we moved to China, and I started taking Chinese during that Tiananmen Square time. So my teacher and I would just go down into the streets, talk to everybody, and I learned it orally. And I learned it fast because I didn't try to learn all the characters, which are, you know, thousands of characters. So I'm pretty good with oral language, and I speak sign language, but I learned that from total immersion with deaf people. You know, it's really the only way you can really learn a language. Oh, so my children, you know, they grew up all over the world. They were made in China, lived in India, they lived in Kenya, they lived in Taiwan. My son has been living in China for the last 4 years. Beijing, he works for a Chinese internet company called Tencent, big, like the Google of China. But he's just been sent back to run their office in San Francisco. So we're happy to have him back in the country. But my daughter, who was working with Google, just decided to go to South Africa. She moved to Cape Town. So she's way over there. And we just went there for Thanksgiving, and we're with both of our children in Cape Town, South Africa. And I said to my daughter, I don't like this. I don't like you living so far away. And she was like, Mom, you created this monster. And that's, I guess, true.
I actually have a question. Is sign language different in different countries, or is it kind of a universal language?
That's a very good question. It's interesting because I love to meet deaf people. When I go out and I see someone deaf, I go right over to them because even though it's different, it is culturally connected. You can communicate. You can understand each other. So, for example, here's a couple examples. In American Sign Language, this is marriage. In Japanese Sign Language, this is marriage. In America, this is boy because it came from the cap when boys wore caps. And this is girl because a girl used to have a bonnet. So that's girl. In Mexico, this is man or mustache. This is woman. So it really is culturally connected, but because it's a visual language, and when you're talking to someone, you know, what you do is like, oh, so that's school? Oh, this is school. Or this is mountains, and they'll say, oh no, this is mountains, you know, and you kind of communicate like that. But I love it. I went to Brazil, and I was at the top of Sugarloaf Mountain, and there were all these deaf kids there. So I went over, and we just started communicating and everything, and then I spent the rest of my time in Brazil with these deaf kids. So fun.
Joanne, you and your husband both have raised citizens of the world. And they are certainly very different from our American-born, raised children. How does this have an effect on both you and your husband, on them insofar as relating to the States? And, there must be some challenge to this.
That's a good question because one thing about my kids, I know that they could go to any country in the world, any city in the world, and that they would be fine. They could survive because they really know how to do it. But my daughter was telling me that she came home and she went to high school, last 2 years of high school here and then college. And then she moved to Cape Town recently, and she said, I feel so much more comfortable here in Cape Town with all these expatriates because I never really felt the same as the American kids. They hadn't traveled, they didn't know about cultures, they were talking about the local movies, and I didn't know about them and all that. So it's interesting. She's really an international kid. Yeah. But I think in today's global society, I'm happy that they're prepared for that because I think we're all going to be needing to be much more global than we are here now.
It was just fabulous. You're just an inspiration, I think, to all of us. I wonder if you could somehow consider this group that travels around training women all over the world. Is there any way that you could start something in Immokalee or other parts right here in Naples where there are young women, I'm sure, that would just fly to the sky if they had the right sorts of pushes in a good direction?
Good question, Jane. The League of Women Voters people came up to me about that very thing because they have a connection with the school there. I forget the name of the school. But they wanted to know if I would go in and do some leadership training there. And I think I could. I mean, I have to decide if that's where I'm going. But, it could really, it could work. Interestingly, in all those years, we brought some Americans together with all the kids from all over the world. But it wasn't, we didn't do it in Washington, D.C., although many people said, why don't you do it in Washington, D.C.? Instead, we would have a program in Washington and maybe bring 3 kids from America, and then kids from all over the world came. So we actually never did a full-out American program. But there's no reason we couldn't. It's totally applicable. Yeah. It's kind of, unfortunately, I basically moved here and it's retired. I mean, I'm here. So I don't know how that's going to work out. But I mean, I still could do the training myself. Anybody else? Huh? You know what? It had a big role. The very first week we were here, Jim was so convinced about Naples. I was not sure yet. We came here, and they have joys and sorrows. So I got up on the microphone and I said, I'm looking for like-minded people. Are there any here? And then afterwards, all these great women came up and talked to me and everything. So then I thought to Jim, yeah, this will work. We can do this. Anyway, thank you for coming out on a Tuesday night. Oh, okay. Thank you for coming tonight. It's very nice of you. Thank you so much. Kind of wild.